Welcome to Facing Displacement, Using Technology to Educate and Communicate on the Increased Risk of Human Trafficking in Destabilized Areas. Thank you for joining us today for this important discussion. My name is Michelle Stegmann. I will be your panel moderator for today. I am the administrator for the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking, a fully volunteer-run organization that coordinates statewide community efforts to end sex trafficking and labor trafficking in New Jersey. We have about 200 volunteers. We have about 180 affiliate organizations, spanning from academia to law enforcement to direct service providers. We empower communities with the knowledge of what human trafficking is, how to prevent it, and how to support those affected by it. One of our guiding principles is that we are a survivor-informed organization, meaning that survivors form a critical component of our leadership, and they guide what we do and how we do it. We have a very interesting and very well-versed panel today talking on areas of their expertise. I'm going to turn it over to the panel to allow them to introduce themselves, and then we'll get rolling with the actual discussion itself. Please note that you have a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to use it to enter questions as we go along. We are fortunate enough to have the Executive Director of the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking, Kate Lee, with us here today, and she will be fielding the questions as they come in and asking them in real time. However, if a question occurs to you as we've moved on through the presentation, no worries. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of the program as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the first speaker to introduce himself, Suleman Masood.
Hello, everyone. My name is Suleman Masood. I currently serve as the Council Chair for the United States Advisory Council on Human Trafficking. The Council is a 11-member entity dedicated to providing recommendations to the President's Senior Policy Operating Group. And I'm also spend most of my time discussing male victimization as well as labor trafficking. Grateful to be here.
Thank you, Suleman. Radu, Cucos.
Hello, thank you, everyone. So my name is Radu Cucos. I work for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I am based in Vienna, Austria, and I'm the program lead on the nexus between technology and trafficking human beings. Myself, I'm from Moldova and happy to be here.
Thank you. Mitzi Perdue.
Hi, I'm Mitzi Perdue, and I'm an anti-trafficking advocate, and I raise money for anti-trafficking organizations, and I write about that. I've had almost 150 articles published since I got into this, and my expertise, it's not great expertise, but I think why I've been invited to be on the panel is I was in Ukraine learning about human trafficking on the border between Ukraine and Poland, and I'll talk about that later.
Wonderful, thank you. Penny Venetis.
Welcome, everyone. I am Penny Venetis. I am a law professor at Rutgers Law School, where I am the director of the International Human Rights Clinic, and I have been working on anti-trafficking matters for several decades, both in the US and abroad, and helped individuals who were victims of trafficking in lawsuits, and also helped draft legislation on both the state level and the federal level in the United States, and have worked on many, many policy issues related to human trafficking.
Thank you, Professor Venetis. And Gina Cavallo.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Gina, and I am a survivor consultant with the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking. I also sit on their board. I'm appointed commissioner for the state of New Jersey and co-chair the American Academy of Pediatrics Task Force Against Human Trafficking, and glad to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gina. All right, starting with Suleman. Suleman, as you know, the structure of the discussion today is basically going to start out talking about setting the table for why displacement creates the environment that can lead to trafficking, and your experiences with refugees at the southern border. When we turn to Radu will be talking about some of the facts, figures, and statistics about human trafficking when it's arising today versus in the past and in prior times. Mitzi will be talking about her experience in Ukraine. Professor Venetis will be discussing Latin America, and then we'll be talking to Gina to kind of summarize and give her input after the panelists are speaking. So starting off with that kind of orientation, can you speak to the impact of or factors involved really in displacement that makes trafficking more likely to occur during displacement than at other times?
Thank you, Michelle. I would say with displacement specifically, in the work that I've done, working directly with migratory populations near the southern border, as well as the neighboring borders, anytime an individual who identifies as a non-citizen is looking to come into the United States, they're coming in for an opportunity, right? Much of the work I've been doing has been surrounding both labor exploitation and labor trafficking. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, I just want to give just broad definitions of each. So when we think about labor exploitation, and thinking specifically for migrants at the southern border, we're thinking about an individual who's working legally but is denied basic legal rights such as fair compensation, breaks, overtime, pay, maybe access to to personal protective equipment to protect them from hazardous materials. When we think about labor trafficking, however, we have to think more in context of working legally but denied basic legal rights through force, fraud, and coercion, right? It's an environment, a hostile work environment that employer is setting up that makes it difficult for an individual to leave. There may be, bonded labor. So debt bondage, for example, may put an individual at a place in an area where they feel that they cannot leave. Although that person may have contact with their family, the contact is always monitored. If that individual may be entering the United States, may be working for either a farm or construction site, may be working at a meatpacking plant, and they may be injured on the job because they were not given personal protective equipment or were using heavy machinery that led to an injury. Even any interaction that they may have with somebody outside that workforce is going to be monitored, making it, again, difficult for that individual to leave. And if a debt is placed on that person's head, even following that victimization, if that person's able to leave and they're displaced, they're in a place of vulnerability. One of the biggest issues for a survivor is the ability, a survivor of trafficking is the ability to trust. I would say the three factors or the three types of barriers that are faced by an individual when displaced is the lack of education, so an educational barrier, a language barrier, and a culture barrier. We have to think in terms of if somebody, even in the context of political destabilization, if they're coming in as a refugee from a different country, or they may be coming in based off of an opportunity, as I mentioned, for a work opportunity, the context is still the same. That culture barrier that exists, given that we live in this Western world with Western services, Western access to resources, that may be sped up, or the language taught or shared, information shared is sped up in a way that's difficult for somebody to comprehend. There's an inherent assumption when somebody is trafficked, that based off of the types of harm that was caused to them, that they're going to be able to know all the intimate details of their trauma right in that moment in order to get services that they need. That really is just not the case. Workers who are exploited for their work, who are not aware of both their state and federal rights, don't have access to information that is appropriately translated. When we think about those educational barriers, it is those rights. There are two sets of rights that I commonly see continue to get overlooked. One set of right being victims' rights, and the second right being your workers' rights. When we think of the victims' rights, right? Even if an individual is involved in a criminal proceeding, right, or a court proceeding, I should say, that individual has a right to restitution. They have a right to write a letter, an impact statement, or a letter to the court. they have a right to be notified of all the court proceedings. When that information, that basic information, is not relayed to them, that creates a barrier in understanding what rights they have, especially when they are displaced and looking to re-enter the workforce. The other set, being the worker rights, is some of what I mentioned already, right? Access to personal protective equipment, access to adequate breaks, access to overtime pay, having a living wage that is meeting the standards of a state and federal wage standard. When these types of rights are violated, it makes it very difficult for an individual to buy in, especially if they don't have an understanding with a service provider on how to articulate the services that they need. I would say creating a culturally responsive approach truly is one of the best ways to help bridge some of the disparities that an individual faces when facing displacement. So, for example, in most cultures, such as the South Asian culture, it is shameful to disclose trauma. It is putting an individual in a place of harm's way if they're detailing intimate details of their trauma. For Asian cultures, family honor plays the most predominant role in society. So when they are facing displacement, being able to be accompanied by an individual from their community, right? Somebody who identifies with their culture, who speaks the language, who understands the cultural norms, being able to have a service provider walk them through and help share and make them understand that they're not alone, right, in this healing journey, I think can help build that trust. I think the other piece I just want to share when we're thinking about displacement is in the United States thinking distinctly around natural disasters, right? I think when we think about natural disasters such as a hurricane, such as an earthquake, right, or wildfires that exist, right, in different parts of the country, it's important that we're thinking intimately about housing. Housing continues to be the most demonstrated need out there. I think the factors that matter the most for an individual when it comes to long-term recovery when displaced through a natural disaster is going to be long-term recovery or aftercare. It's going to be rebuilding and renewing an individual's financial stability and security, being able to support them emotionally long-term. So being able to instill emotional stability, family and community cohesion, because when that individual is displaced, especially somebody who identifies as a migrant or a non-citizen, they're displaced from their family. They're away from their culture. They're away from their identity, from what made them, right? All of that was made as a sacrifice in order for them to find employment and be able to provide that money back to their family back home. Next, I would say community health and life trajectory are all these types of wellness initiatives that a service provider should be taking to assist an individual who may be displaced. I think I'll pause there. If there's any follow-up.
Thank you. Lots of information and all of it, very impactful. So if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like, we actually have to, at some point, take a look at the definition of displacement, right? We think about, political destabilization leading to displacement because people are, kind of thrust out of their homes, in that instance, but it doesn't have to necessarily be political destabilization. Many things can lead to displacement, and displacement itself can actually mean different things.
Correct. I mean, both basically get you to an end result that basically extends inequalities such as racial and class disparities. It extends to inequitable housing, lack of employment, lack of education, a need for economic security or stability, ensuring that the community is invested in supporting any victim of trafficking or individual who may be trafficked as a result of being displaced from their home.
And so you touch upon the point of trauma. So trauma can leave a person vulnerable to the manipulations of traffickers. And that's what traffickers thrive on, is the ability to manipulate. They're very expert at doing that. So that can arise either from a person's just natural background in the environment in which they grew up, or it can arise because of some event like a natural disaster or political destabilization, I think is what I'm hearing.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the ways that we can best combat, or at least find ways to resolve, because I think one area that I think other members on this panel will understand is when a victim is displaced, and they're in a position where they have lost their home, they have lost their income, they have lost their basic needs, right? Access to food, access to shelter, and access to even equitable health resources. This puts an individual in a place where they have to meet those needs somewhere, right? Unfortunately, that may come at the hands of a trafficker. For trafficking, I mean, when we think about natural disasters, we may automatically equate that to the physical damage that may exist in the community, but the long-term damage is the people that are affected through it, right? And this gives prime opportunity for those traffickers to intervene, to be that source, to be that guiding light, and to provide everything that individual is lacking in. So being able, I think, following any type of natural disaster or following any type of displacement that a migrant worker may experience, I think it's important for communities to be able, at a state level, right, from a state government, from a federal government, from a local government, or just from a community standpoint, being able to develop and create positions of community navigators, right? Community navigators, ombudsmen, victim advocates that are dedicated and have that specific expertise to meet the needs of that individual. And again, it's through the needs of a cultural response, an education response, and maybe even a language response. Too often, there's that assumption that because that individual experienced all these intimate details of their trauma and may not be able to articulate that equates to trafficking. So being able to really hold their hand and be in a place where they can meet them where they're at, and support every aspect of resource that is needed to help them on their healing journey.
And so often a person isn't even necessarily aware that they're being trafficked at first or through much of the experience. It might not be until after the conclusion that, looking back at it, they're able to come to the conclusion of what actually occurred. And this also goes to, we need to have a coalition of responders that are able to respond, as you indicated, in different ways. How do we coordinate all of that? And how do we get that education / communication to the people that need to hear it most? And I think that's the challenge that we're here, really kind of discussing today. So thank you. I am going to move on to Radu, but also keep in mind all of the panelists. It's an open discussion. So if somebody is speaking and something occurs to you, please feel free to jump in and offer your thoughts and insights as well. So Radu, thank you for joining us, and the OSCE gathering facts, figures, and statistics relating to various things that occur in the world, including human trafficking. Very difficult to do because it's so hard, as we're all finding, to get a handle on the numbers. Because unlike, say, reporting cases of chicken pox, within the United States within a given year, where providers can just take the numbers after lab tests and report them up the line, this is, very difficult, covert, underground kind of information that is hard to suss out and pull together. And yet the OSCE has done it. And thank you so much for existing. So as I was discussing earlier, in the past, we had seen situations where there had been political destabilization in areas, and then there was a lag. There was a period of time after that. And then somewhere down the road, 6 months, 12 months, we would start to see uptick in trafficking. From what I'm understanding, that statistic is now changing, and we are seeing it happening real time. So there's political destabilization, like, for example, the war in Ukraine, and almost immediately we see this uptick in trafficking activity. And so I wanted to turn it over to you to kind of walk us through what we're experiencing.
Sure. Thank you very much, Michelle. I just want to make sure, do you see the slides?
Yes,
Do you see just one slide or do you see the presenter's mode?
just one slide.
Okay, perfect. Well, very happy and honored to be here. Thank you for the invitation. As I said, I work for the OSCE. Our job is to support the 57 OSCE participating states to combat trafficking in human beings. Now, you mentioned very correctly that when there are different crises around the world, this has an impact on human trafficking and exploitation of people. And let's say in the last 10 to 15 years, there were two major crises in the OSCE area where we tried to measure from the quantitative point of view the impact on the trafficking crime. It was the migration crisis related to some military actions in the Middle East, and right now with the war in Ukraine. And in my presentation, I really want to focus more on the war in Ukraine because this is kind of the first time when we developed a framework to also look at data and to understand better what's going on. So as you well know, Russia attacked Ukraine last year and started unprovoked war against Ukraine. And in our office, we immediately realized that this will have impact on millions of vulnerable people from Ukraine, which left their homes in Ukraine. Some of them moved outside of Ukraine. Some of them moved within Ukraine to safer places. This case is important for me, not just professionally, but also personally, because I'm from the Republic of Moldova, which borders Ukraine. And I also hosted a family of Ukrainians in my apartment in Chisinau, and I've seen what devastating impact this war has. But we also try to focus on data to collect very concrete data and understand what's going on. We have to say first that some demographic figures collected by NGO in Romania, which along with Poland has received largest number of refugees, demonstrate how this refugee crisis is problematic in regards to trafficking for sexual exploitation, because 85% of refugees are female, 60% are between the ages 18 and 42, 66% are traveling with at least one child, meaning their financial situation is more precarious and need for work is even greater. The situation generates immediate concern with regards to trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, as over 90% of all identified victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation are women and girls. We visited the countries neighboring Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, where we've seen how the risk of trafficking are real and the measures have to be taken. But we have to understand that this risk of exploitation, they do not exist immediately at the border, right, where refugees are being received, but they exist in many European cities where men especially are willing to pay for sex, and that's how the crisis is connected to the situation of Ukrainian refugees. Usually, we call human trafficking, we look at it as a marketplace. There's demand and there's supply, and in order to understand if a certain situation of crisis has an impact on human trafficking, we're looking for different signals in this marketplace, either an uptick in supply or an uptick in demand. So immediately in the months the war started, we started to monitor online platforms with high risk of trafficking to better understand what's going on and to understand if there's increases and supply or demand related to vulnerable Ukrainians. So coinciding with the mass movement of vulnerable women and girls, there has been a surge in online searches across Europe using terms related to buying sex from Ukrainian women. In some countries, by as much as 600%. The term Ukrainian refugee porn was even trending on Google Analytics in the aftermath of the crisis, with some of these videos garnering tens of thousands of views online. In other words, one of the early measurable reaction within the European Union to this crisis were the attempts by men to identify and have sex with women and girls fleeing the conflict. So, I mean, let's that sink in for a moment. The influx of vulnerable women and girls into Western Europe led to an immediate increase in interest by Europeans men in exploiting them. And this is a response to your remark about, you know, the existence of human trafficking risks immediately after the crisis. One of the explanation we have here at the office, it's because the role of technology, because right now technology is misused by trafficker at every stage of human trafficking crime, and because of technology is easy, very easy to commit the human trafficking crime. So, but not only are sex buyers displaying this interest in exploiting Ukrainian women, they're already acted on it. So, for example, in Sweden, 30 out of 38 men arrested last year for attempting to purchase sexual services or trying to specifically access Ukrainian women. In Ireland, the largest website for paid sexual services, Escort Ireland, self-reported a 250% increase in interest in sexual access to Ukrainian women, and even advertised their services as an ethical way to live out your war-inspired fantasies. In Austria, where prostitution is legal, the number of searches for sexual access to Ukrainian was so high that the cyber police had to proactively contact men who had searched for it online to discourage them from trying to buy sex from Ukrainian women. A reaction that I can assure you is not in the nature of Austrian law enforcement. That is how great the scale of demand is. Data companies have also noticed a substantial increase in online advertisement featuring Ukrainian women and girls. Even if the women depicted in those ads are not Ukrainian, the impact is clear. Men are trying to purchase sexual services from Ukrainian women, and this will in turn inspire traffickers to identify and exploit vulnerable children. So as I mentioned, we wanted to see the signal in the prostitution marketplace across Europe to see, will there be an increase in demand, which fuels sexual exploitation and trafficking? And we've clearly seen the demand. I mean, the increase in search terms related to Ukrainian pornography or escort went 600%, which is unbelievable. We also have seen that actually people exploiting other people, they kind of reacted to this increase in demand. So we monitored also some Telegram channels where some individuals were trying to recruit Ukrainians to work in webcams, for example. So this is an ad from such a channel which says that there's work for women. When it comes to age, they say from and 3 points, which means like there's no age limit until 65 years old to work in chats. And obviously probably is chats, erotic chats for $100 an hour. So this is a proof that also on demand side, the people exploiting vulnerable categories of people, they responded to the demand and they tried to recruit Ukrainians to also work in the prostitution industry. So at the OSCE, we try to provide guidance to countries. We have 57 participating states, and we issued a set of recommendations on enhancing efforts to identify and mitigate risks of trafficking in human beings online as a result of the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. And recommendations include things like mapping online platforms of high risk of trafficking, proactively looking for patterns of trafficking on those platforms, also to look at too good to be true job offers that Ukrainians could respond to. And in that way, they could be recruited and then exploited by traffickers. We will also advise countries to work with tech companies to ensure that they implement awareness raising campaigns for Ukrainians. So I advise you to go on our website. But we also wanted to have our own campaign in order to provide information, vital information to refugees to make sure that they are aware of human trafficking risks. And we partnered with Thomson Reuters on this great project. We call this campaign Be Safe campaign. We developed a website where we provide very simple but useful information to Ukrainians that are in transit or in host countries, where we provide resources such as phone numbers where they can call in case they think they could be in an exploitative situation. We also had a social media awareness campaign, which was promoted by the First Lady of Ukraine as well, and was pretty popular. And the key themes of this campaign is how to stay safe while on the move or settling, what are the warning signs of human trafficking, what to do if you are in danger. We also work with governments, NGOs, law enforcement, and we've seen that the response to this campaign was very positive. As I mentioned, we have launched a website together with Thomson Reuters. We have anti-trafficking advice in 3 languages. We have resources from 15 countries, and we also had a tri-language social media campaign. We analyzed what are the online platforms most frequently used by Ukrainian refugees to make sure that our campaign had an impact, and we raised awareness on those platforms. So that's about it. But just to underline your question, why do we see this risk of trafficking immediately happening after a crisis situation? And there are different factors, but one of the main thing that we see is that technology plays a greater role, as technology connects very easily the supply side, the demand side. Traffickers can use technology to recruit victims online, to control them online. It's very easy to contact. They can make fake profiles. So this is one of the reasons we believe this is happening. So thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer to your questions.
Thank you so much, Radu. What a fascinating presentation, very insightful information, and also what incredible work you guys have done so far. So as you mentioned, the role of technology really being in the forefront in terms of facilitating traffickers to be able to do what they do, but also to be able to get the word out to help prevent the situation from occurring. And I think going forward, it's going to be virtually all technology based. And I know some of the questions that came in related to exactly that question: how can we leverage technology? So thank you for that. So moving now then to Mitzi, who was boots on ground actually in Ukraine at the Polish border. So Mitzi, you've been to Ukraine twice in the last year, and it had to do with human trafficking. Why did you go there?
Oh, I had a fantastic, I don't know, kind of almost coincidence that happened, because I've been writing about human trafficking, and I had written a story for Psychology Today on trafficking in Ukraine. And my source was I had met a person who's from Odessa, he lived in Odessa, he and his wife left and went to Warsaw right after the war began. And he was fairly wealthy, so he was able to pay for a hotel for 6 weeks until he could get to the United States. But while he was in Warsaw, he got to see how many people who how many women who couldn't afford to pay for a hotel, and they need shelter. They're not going to survive without their needs being taken care of. He got to witness just the phenomenal scale of women who were forced into accepting being trafficked. Well, I wrote this story for Psychology Today, and here's the amazing coincidence. There's a man in Ukraine, he's head of the Kyiv region police, that he has 64,000 people under him. So, this is a big deal. Well, he had written his master's thesis as part of law enforcement on human trafficking. And my article in Psychology Today, because it had the word Ukraine and trafficking in it, it came to his attention. And pretty soon I'm on a Zoom call to Kyiv, talking with General Nebitov, who invited me to come see for myself what I had written about. Well, somewhere like 10 days later, I'm in Ukraine and I'm a guest of the police department. And, for those of you who haven't been to Ukraine during a war, it's a somewhat hairy experience, because my first night there, I spent it in a bomb shelter. There were 40 attacks on Kyiv that night. And I can go on right now and describe the things that I saw. Would you like me to do that, Michelle?
Yes, please do.
Okay, one of the things that I got to see was at the border between Poland and Ukraine. It's a town called Medvika. And I happened to be standing beside a guy. We were waiting in line to cross. And the line to cross, at least when I was there the first time, we're talking August, it's probably a 3-hour wait. And so I'm talking with somebody that I'm standing beside. He happens to be in anti-trafficking, and his background was what's the word for it? Security. He was like an ex-SEAL, and he just knew so much of what to look for that would have been completely invisible to me. But I'm going to describe the kinds of things that he told me were going on. And I'm going to guess that there's like a crowd of, I didn't count, but 750 people waiting to cross. And it's this 3-hour wait. And he invited me to look at 3 guys who were, it seemed to me, taking selfies. And actually, do you know what? I've confused the story. It's when the story that I'm about to tell happens to be when I'm on the Ukrainian side going over to Poland. Okay, so here we are, me standing beside this guy in intelligence, and he points out 3 guys who are taking selfies. At least I thought they were taking selfies. He said, that's not what they're doing. He said, notice the angle. I'm pretending that this is a selfie phone, a smartphone. The angle is such that they're not taking pictures of themselves. Those 3 guys are spotters. And what they're doing is they pick out of these, say, 500 to 1,000 people who are processing through, they pick out the ones who are going to be most useful to the traffickers. Maybe it's a woman who's particularly vulnerable because she's got like a 6-year-old child. Maybe her clothes indicate that she hasn't changed them in 5 days. They're wrinkled, they're rumpled, the shoes are dusty. And then maybe she has what the intelligence guy described as the 1,000-yard stare, where she's kind of enduring maybe the equivalent of PTSD, but she's just so overloaded, so overwhelmed, so tired, probably hungry, just out of it, that it makes her a perfect target for the trafficker on the other side. And so the 3 guys who are apparently taking selfies, they're taking a picture of her because they're spotters, and they're going to send that selfie picture to the person on the other side, which makes it very efficient for this particular brand of trafficking, because the person on the other side doesn't have to waste time, people flowing by. Nope, he can focus exactly on that girl in the orange and white blouse. And he comes up to her, and very typically he'll tell her, "Oh, you look like you could use a hot meal. You need a nice place to stay for your daughter, and I can help you find work. Come with me, but the van leaves in 5 minutes. So, get in right now." Well, that woman is, the guy in intelligence told me, that woman's going to make the worst mistake of her life, because here is what we know from people who've been found and brought back. It's typical. I'm not going to say it happens every time, but how about it happens lots, that woman is going to be raped 30 times that night. Now, why rape a woman 30 times that night? Well, the guy in intelligence, he's in anti-trafficking, but his background is intelligence. The guy told me that we know this happens. They talk with the women who have been rescued. The reason that the traffickers are going to rape her 30 times that night is they want to completely destroy her soul. They want just almost a soulless husk of a human being left over after this terrible experience, which means that they can control her more easily. That's what I saw on the Ukrainian side, the spotters. Now let's go to the other side. And again, something that I saw with my own eyes. This is when I was first entering Ukraine, about maybe a quarter of a mile away. It's a little bit hard to judge. I went by car from Warsaw to Medvika, and to walk from the parking lot to where you cross, and again, great crowds of people. But I saw a couple of really attractive looking women being escorted into one of these vans. And again, somebody that I was walking beside told me, it's a real good idea not to stare at what you're looking at in this field in a distance, quarter of a mile away. But those women are about to be trafficked. And he said, it's a real good idea not to stare, just pretend you're not seeing anything, because the traffickers don't take kindly to anybody interfering with what they're doing. I mean, not that I could if it's a quarter of a mile away and I'm 81 and not much that I could do, but that the traffickers, they're perfectly capable of, singling out people who look dangerous to them and like abducting them and using them from organ harvesting. I was told this, I can't be sure that particular part's true. I can be sure of what I mentioned about the spotters. The impression that I got, and this is also from talking with police, that the traffickers are just extraordinarily experienced and knowledgeable and professional about getting the women. And ask me more questions, or what else would you like me to talk about?
Well, so I think this kind of circles back to some of the things that Suleman was saying in terms of the situation that occurs when somebody is displaced. And so there's this pressure situation, this immediacy of action that has to be taken that, it presents itself, and that traffickers are obviously taking advantage of. So in order to prevent that from occurring, I think a couple of things at least have to take place, one of which is to kind of slow the process to give people potentially at vulnerability of being trafficked, a chance to catch their breath, stop, think, be able to make that choice or not make that choice. And then the second thing is communication and education about what exactly is going on, because suddenly people are here at the border, they don't know, they don't have a home anymore. This is not obviously something that's familiar to them. And so they really don't know the specifics of the danger that exists there. So I understand you've had some thoughts about maybe things that can be done in those on those tracks. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. The general who's the chief of police or the head of police for Kyiv region, General Nebutov, he'd written his master's thesis on this. So, I'm saying, what can be done? What can be done? Well, here's something that I sold my engagement ring on December 7th, and the money for it, at least a big chunk of it, is going to rehab a damaged building near the Medvika border. And this building, it can hold 30 people overnight. It can hold more people for kind of educational purposes. And the idea is that when it's done, and they were hoping for March, but I don't expect it to be done before May, that this building, this rehabbed building, will be sort of a timeout for the most vulnerable women. And, if the traffickers the spotters can figure out who's really vulnerable, so can the police. So what if that woman, the one that I described with the 6-year-old girl who's got the 1,000-yard stare, what if she could have like a night in a safe place where she can talk with other women and where she can be warned on what's the other side, and she can be told, there are very good NGOs who will help you, but this guy who tells you get in my van in 5 minutes, don't go with him. And so I'm really, really happy that that there will be, when this shelter is ready for operation, that there will be large numbers of women who won't be trafficked. But then there's an even better part of that. There are two really good parts of it. One is that the publicity surrounding this shelter, and it's already happening, means that it's in radio, newspaper, and television in Ukraine right now. They're talking about why this shelter is needed. And so that I could even guess that much more than this shelter is the fact that people are talking about it's being needed. So I'm hoping, it's not going to solve the problem, but it can make some kind of dent in it. Then there's another part, and the part that I'm going to share right now is directed to Gina, my wonderful friend Gina. This is something that I heard from the Ukrainian police, that at the time that I talked with them, they believe that there are hundreds of thousands, maybe 500,000 women, maybe much more than that, who've been trafficked, but they rarely come to the police. And the reason that they rarely come to the police, maybe they're even rescued and then they just do everything they can to disappear into their community. And I was told that the reason for this is, if you've been, as it's described locally, if you've been a prostitute, rather than a victim of trafficking, but the way kind of it's presented is that you've been a prostitute, there goes your chances of marriage, there goes your chance of even getting back to your husband, there goes your chance of being accepted in your village, that a woman has huge incentives not to be public about it. To me, that's tragic beyond imagination, because if you're not going to get any counseling or support, I think that just doubles the trauma. And so one of the things that I've been doing is I'm working with the vice mayor of the Lviv Oblast. I write articles here in the United States, often about one a week, talking about how healing it is to be able to talk with others. And the vice mayor of Lviv is using my articles, translating them into Ukrainian, adding her touch to it so that she and I are co-authors. But with the idea of, hey, everybody, let's be more compassionate about what people have been through. And I'm assuming that the vice mayor of Lviv is going to package this so that it's culturally acceptable. But she tells me she's very excited that the idea that in the US we're just so much more public about it, because you can help people if you know their situation. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
And we see that again and again, right, Mitzi, where silence, enshrouding a situation, just perpetuates the situation, because people feel that they have to hide. People feel, shame around that, and bringing it out into the light where there can be open discussion is, such a game changer. And it takes time, but change occurs.
Well, again, one person isn't going to solve everything, but it's got to make a difference if they hear from an American who's co-authoring it with a Ukrainian woman, that we celebrate the heroes and their healing journey. We're trying to like reframe it. And again, I don't know how much impact it will have or won't have, but I'm hopeful.
Wonderful. Question for you. I'm just curious. So you saw these things happening. The national security expert you were with also saw these things happening. Did you see any response from police in the area, or are they just kind of so overwhelmed with the flow of the immigration process to begin with that and the war that they can't really turn their attentions to it?
I mentioned that there's a huge number of people in the Kyiv region police, and I actually have talked with many of the people who specialize in human trafficking. There is I'm not sure if you call it a division or what, but there's a portion of the Kyiv region police that's specifically devoted to human trafficking. And they use, I even got to see some high-tech ways that they have of tracking people, like trafficking, figuring out license plates and which bus driver is doing what. So to my mind, they're doing a brilliant job with the resources they have, and this is what they do. So it's not, they're not border guards, by the way. The people who are part of the trafficking subsection of the Ukrainian police, they're passionate about it. And since the chief or the general is interested enough that he wrote his master's thesis on it, it's not being ignored. It's just that the problem is so big.
Understood. Well, thank you very much. Let's turn now to Professor Penny Venetis to address Latin America.
Thank you, Michelle. This is so sobering listening to this, even though it is my work as well. It is really sobering to hear these reports, and thank you to my fellow panelists for the amazing work that they're doing. And thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. So I just want to remind our audience of the definition of trafficking, just a refresh. And trafficking requires force, fraud, and coercion. And these terms include any situation where an individual is forced to do something against their will, or where they're tricked into doing something by someone who is lying to them or not telling them the full truth about a particular situation. Force can be active and physical, or indirect and psychological, such as threats. Coercion refers to behavior including threats or harm, a physical restraint, harming someone else in the family, trying to get a person to believe that if they don't do something, it will result in serious harm to them or to someone else. It also includes the abuse or the threatened abuse of the law or the legal process. And fraud refers to intentionally distorting the truth in order to get someone who relies on that version of the truth to surrender a legal right or to give something up that belongs to them, including their own autonomy. Human trafficking is the most pervasive illicit market in the world. And traffickers profit globally to the tune of $150 billion a year. And trafficked individuals are a renewable commodity who, unlike drugs that can be consumed once, trafficked individuals can be consumed over and over and over and over again. And all they need is a little bit of sleep or drugs to force them to continue to be trafficked, and there's sex trafficking and labor trafficking. I know we've spoken a lot about sex trafficking. There's also labor trafficking. I'm going to talk about Latin America in particular, one, because it's close to home to the US, but the other reason is because a lot of the factors that my fellow panelists have talked about, displacement, migration, violence, unstable governments, really have exacerbated human trafficking in the Americas. So Latin America consists of 33 countries, which is, Central South America and the Caribbean. And there's a debate over whether Mexico is part of Latin America. For purposes of this discussion, I will include it in the definition of Latin America. As my fellow panelists said, there are both personal and political factors that make an individual vulnerable to trafficking. So I'll talk about some of the personal conditions, living conditions, sexual abuse or violence, substance abuse, homelessness, runaways in particular are vulnerable, and that the runaway population includes in large part LGBTQ plus community members who were kicked out by their families. There's a lot of family members are involved in trafficking members of their family, caretakers, unstable housing, economic hardship. I know that others have mentioned this. And then there's also political factors, governments that are just non-functional, where there is no law enforcement, there is rampant violence, there's political instability, there are no jobs, there's no medical care, there's incredible inflation. So that's the political aspect, and it's often a combination of both the personal risk factors and the political risk factors that lead someone to be trafficked. Latin America Latin American countries have a tremendous amount of trafficking, and in part because Latin America has the highest rates of income inequality of any region in the world. Latin America accounts for 11 out of the 25 developing economies with the highest level of income inequality. So 11 out of the 33 countries in Latin America have the highest income inequality in the world. Central America in particular is ranked 4th in the world for trafficking after Western Asia, East Africa, and Southern Asia. So I'm going to focus on some political hotspots where we see where there is mass migration and political instability, just to point out the sort of the extent of the human trafficking in those countries. And as folks mentioned, technology plays a big part in the trafficking enterprises in these countries. So I'm going to focus on Mexico at first, which I've included in the definition of Latin America. And Mexico has its own problems, and it has a very, very high level of trafficking, particularly among children. And there's tremendous amount of labor trafficking in Mexico, as well as sex trafficking. So in the agricultural fields, domestic service, childcare, mining, food processing, construction, tourism, all of those industries right across the border from the U.S. Are rife with trafficked individuals who are lured to job sites through fake ads and are exploited as a result. But Mexico is also a lot of the trafficking in Mexico is also due to migration to Mexico from other parts of Latin America. So folks may have heard of what is pejoratively referred to as, quote unquote, the migrant caravan. And that is thousands and thousands of people who are fleeing from violence, particularly gang violence, sexual violence, sexual abuse, gender-related violence, and a lack of law enforcement and corrupt governments in places in Central America like Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And the collapsed governments there are so dysfunctional or are actually complicit with criminal enterprises that people are fleeing for their lives. And they move north into Mexico. And they had been traveling in groups in a caravan, which actually makes sense. So it's not like covered wagons or anything, but moving steadily to the Mexican border where they try to enter the United States. And in certain respects, traveling in a group offers a lot of protection. But there are people who prey on members of the group, and there are people in the group who are also affiliated with traffickers. So we're talking about a group of people traveling through Central America into Mexico towards the U.S. border, numbering, somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000. And members of that group have been preyed upon by traffickers who, offer them jobs, who they use fraudulent recruitment practices. And the Mexican government is really not enforcing its anti-trafficking obligations to its own people and also to the migrants who are coming through the country. And frankly, the Mexican government wants to get rid of those migrants because it really, sort of doesn't offer a sustainable way of life to many of its own people. People have been kidnapped and killed who are traveling through this caravan. They have been sexually assaulted, sexually abused. Mexico has set up points within the country where the migrants can get shelter. There are members of drug cartels and trafficking, smuggling organizations that just kidnap people from this from this what's been called as a migrant caravan. And also, like Mitzi described, at the border, at the Polish-Ukrainian border, there are a lot of people to choose from, and these people are highly skilled. One of the tactics that's used with folks traveling into Mexico is people pretending to be concerned in starting a relationship with people. There's a lot of contact because people are moving on foot, of people saying, oh, I can help you, or oh, you're beautiful, can I help you? I really would like to take care of you. So there's this very, very desperate, hopeless people are lured into thinking that somebody is going to care for them and somebody is going to love them and be in a relationship with them, and it really is a trafficking ploy. So not only is Mexico a hub of trafficking on its own, but also it has the trafficking has increased with people fleeing from other parts of Latin America, particularly Central America. I want to, turn over now to talk about the island of Hispaniola, which is the Dominican Republic and Haiti, where there has also been just this, sort of skyrocketing in human trafficking. I'll start with Haiti first, and then talk about the Dominican Republic. Haiti has seen just, sort of incredible disasters in the past few years. So there was a massive earthquake there in 2021 that registered 7.2 on the Richter scale. And also, right after that, there was Tropical Storm Grace, which, completely devastated Haiti. And, as a result of the tropical storm, 26,000 people were displaced in Haiti. Haiti is one of the poorest countries in the world. More than 70% of the people live below the poverty level, and that increased to over 86% after these disasters. 50% of the population in Haiti lives on less than $1.26 a day. And the statistic is a few years old, but people in Haiti live on very, very little trafficking. It is, people are very, very desperate. There's also been a lot of displacement because Haiti and the Dominican Republic that share Hispaniola are two separate countries, and the Dominican Republic decided to expel people, Haitian nationals who were working as undocumented individual in the Dominican Republic, sometimes for generations. So there's, sort of a displacement of those individuals. So most of Haiti's trafficking involves children and forced labor and sex trafficking, and children who work in domestic service, which is called restavet, where they are, children are physically abused. They receive no payment for their services. They don't go to school. Another thing that folks haven't talked about that we really need to focus on is that there are organizations like quote unquote orphanage entrepreneurs and organizations posing as social services organizations that, may mean well, but actually are sometimes complicit in sex trafficking and labor trafficking rings. And some even get governmental money, both from their own governments or also from NGOs who think they're doing good work and internationally. And they actually are locales where children in particular can be sex trafficked. And this is in Haiti in particular. There's also a lot of child bride buying, where children and women are listed in catalogs where someone can pay between $100 to $200 to actually buy a human being as a bride. And this is, families will sell their children, and this is girls as young as 14 years of age. The people we talked about income inequality in Latin America, commercial sex trafficking that stays within the country of Haiti takes place in upscale neighborhoods. There's a thriving sex trafficking industry in, sexual tourism industry in Hispaniola, both in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And so anyway, it's really, these are well-established enterprises, and the government is very, very poor and has recently experienced natural disasters. The hospitals have been shut down even during the COVID pandemic, and people, there's really sort of no relief, and Haitians are really prime targets for trafficking. And folks talked about the need for education, that, there's a poll that was conducted in 2020, and 71% of the respondents didn't even know what trafficking was. They didn't have knowledge of to differentiate between trafficking and physical abuse or sexual abuse, and only 3% of the population knew about anti-trafficking measures, both domestically and globally. So let's cross the border into the Dominican Republic, which is also a very, very poor country. 22% of residents of the Dominican Republic live below the poverty rate. And that has increased 2% since 2019. And the folks in the Dominican Republic live on roughly on an annual salary of $8,000 per year. The Dominican Republic is a mecca for sex tourism, mostly for children. And traffickers operate in established networks, and they use technology to mask their activities, including the dark web. They recruit children in particular using WhatsApp chats on social media, and then they lure them into the sex tourism industry. And the government really does not make any efforts to stop the traffickers. Traffickers lure Dominican women in particular to work in nightclubs, not only in the Dominican Republic, but Dominican women are exported to the Middle East, Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America. where they're sex trafficked, and also members of the LGBTQ community are also trafficked internationally from the Dominican Republic. So you have poverty, you have natural disasters, you have a dispute at the border, you know, some of the themes that we are seeing over and over being really turning particular countries into flashpoints for human trafficking. And here in, you know, the situation between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, really there's, you know, kind of no end in sight. The economies are really, really struggling. And the governmental infrastructure is just really not there to, you know, sort of put systems in place to make life better for people who live there and to prevent trafficking. I'm going to talk about Venezuela as well in South America. So Venezuela, you know, under sort of in the last 20 years, basically, you know, the economy has really, you know, plummeted. The collapse of the oil market has really left the economy, you know, devastated. And every single source that I consulted said, referred to what's happening in Venezuela as you know, a crisis. And also, as a result, Venezuela has the second largest migration of population in the world. So 7 million people have left Venezuela since 2015, according to the BBC. It's an autocratic government, the government of Maduro. Even though there was an election that supposedly threw him out of office, he still is in place. So he's not moving. Venezuela, the government is really, you know, sort of has essentially, you know, collapsed. In the UN published a report in 2014 saying that, you know, Venezuela was so unsafe and the country had become so violent that people could be robbed in broad daylight outside on the street. People are afraid to go home. The inflation rate has risen to over 60%. The economy is completely destabilized. And, you know, as a result, trafficking is rife in the country. With 7 million people displaced, traffickers have access to a lot of desperate people. And Venezuelans have been trafficked to Aruba, the Bahamas, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, China, Colombia, Costa Rica, Germany, Egypt, Ecuador, Haiti, Iceland, Spain. So Venezuelans are, and this is primarily for sex, but also for forced labor. So desperate people are trafficked throughout the world. And women and girls in particular are trafficked to Colombia, Ecuador, and Trinidad and Tobago. And transgender women in particular are also trafficked, but many of them are trafficked to Europe, to Spain and Germany, where they're lured with fraudulent employment opportunities and promises that life will be better for them as transgender individuals. But when they're there, they're actually forced to undergo surgical procedures before they are sold into commercial sex. So Venezuela is another hotspot. And again, it doesn't look like things will get better anytime soon. I also want to quickly mention Brazil because their children in particular are exploited, and it's less of a migration as compared to the other countries that we discussed, but also just really is just horrendous conditions for children. Brazil is the third largest economy in the Americas, and it's described as a developing industrial nation. So unfortunately, 60 million people in Brazil are poor, and the economy is really, really slowing down, and inflation is increasing. In Brazil, there are children who literally live on the streets, and there's you know, kids who are dispatched by their families to go and earn money. and they have at least sort of a center where they can return, but there are kids who actually live on the street, and they're called children of the streets. And they're mostly boys, but they're also girls as well. And it's becoming more and more common for girls to be of the streets. And these kids are sex trafficked, and in exchange for food or affection. There are kids as young as 5 or 6 who are living on the streets and are doing whatever they can to survive. They're used as runners by the police, who they inform the police of what's happening, and they're homeless and use sex as a way to survive. Girls are dressed up as prostitutes. This happens in the broad daylight. During Carnival, which is, everybody from all around the world travels to Brazil for their famous Carnival in Rio. That is there are many, many children who are sex trafficked, and people come from around the world to have sex with children and engage in sex tourism. And the sex tourism, thousands of children are involved in sex tourism, and the recruiting methods are familiar. Job offers, smuggling, intimate partner, betrayals, technology, and the Brazilian government is really not doing anything to stop this. And I think countries that welcome sex tourism know perfectly well what is happening, particularly when they welcome and do not protect children in the sex tourist industry. It's worth noting that folks leaving these countries and making their way to the Mexican border end up in the United States. There are people who take advantage of unaccompanied minors coming across the border and pretend to be relatives. There was one man who was recently arrested who was sponsoring 40 children, saying that he was a relative and saying that he was their sponsor, and he would immediately put those kids to work. And the one child who was 13 reported that when he arrived in Florida to see the sponsor who pretended to be a relative, he was told that he needed more than $4,000 to pay off the expenses of bringing him to the US. And the debt kept increasing, and he couldn't go to school, or he was deceived into thinking he could go to school. And then he was was forced to work. These kids, social services and schools have noticed that kids are falling asleep in class. These unaccompanied minors are falling asleep in class. The Department of Health and Human Services, unfortunately, couldn't reach a third of the unaccompanied migrant children who entered the U.S. And that's about 85,000 children who are really who have fallen by the wayside. So mass migration and the political instability and economic instability in Latin America is pervasive, and we see the ramifications and the impact it has on human trafficking, not only in Latin America, but also in the US. And these kids who are off the radar screen are really primed to be trafficked in the United States as well, and exploited in the United States. And many of them are, instead of being monitored and sent to school and taken care of. So, what's the solution? It's really hard, right? We need stable economies, we need stable governments, we need non-corrupt governments. And we really need to pay attention globally when a government becomes destabilized, and to pump resources there so that it doesn't destabilize further, and so that traffickers don't have their pick of the litter in getting their victims. And these enterprises are organized. They know what they're doing, as Mitzi talked about with the selfies. And they use social media to facilitate their criminal enterprises and their commission of gross human rights abuses. So I don't have anything positive to report, but I just wanted to focus a lens on some of what's happening in Latin America. And I just wanted to, before I close, that there are thousands of Ukrainian women who have ended up actually at the US-Mexico border and seeking entry into the US. And they are also just, rife for exploitation and being trafficked. This is how they made their way from the Ukraine and Poland to the Mexican border is, that the enterprises to get them there are very organized, and they had to cross the ocean, and they had to cross many, many borders to get from the Ukraine to Mexico.
Thank you, Professor. So, and I think this touches on, there is so much of an intersection between immigration issues and trafficking issues. And I think we could devote an entire program just to that. And actually we have in the past. But it leads to kind of the thought process of, I think this kind of points up a problem or an issue actually with using technology to kind of educate and communicate with potential trafficking victims, which is that, not every single person has a cell phone, although they're pretty widespread throughout the world. But even if they do have a cell phone, you're talking about people who might be physically walking across thousands of miles, across other country borders, into different service zones. They might not necessarily even have access to the internet at that point. And so to get those kinds of messages would take a specific kind of technology that, is in process right now and being developed, but doesn't really fully exist. So, it's a challenge. How do we get around that? And I don't know that there's really an answer for that.
No, you're absolutely right. And the other thing, the thing to take into account are these are people who are fleeing their governments because their governments have failed them. If they get a public service announcement from a governmental organization, they may very well be suspicious of that. And they, rather than, sort of getting communication by someone who wants to offer them a job and tells them about a job. So it's really, sort of it's hard, even if the messaging is created and there's a way to, get the messages to people who are moving and escaping for their lives and who are desperate. The question is, how do you get them to read that message as opposed to something where they and their children are, promised falsely, safety, food, a job, shelter.
Exactly. Well, let's turn now to our final speaker, Gina Cavallo. Gina, welcome. It's nice to see you.
Thank you, Michelle.
We've had some discussions that every speaker has mentioned, the concept of displacement. And as, Suleman and I discussed a little bit in the beginning, displacement actually can mean different things. And yet it always seems to have some role in creating vulnerability to trafficking. So, even from a domestic perspective in the United States, what are your views on, kind of what displacement means, that brings us to the point where it's making somebody more vulnerable?
Thank you, Michelle. First of all, I just want to reel back a little bit and just mention again, because I think it's really important that we be mindful about this at all times, that trafficking comes in many forms and discriminates against no one. And that includes boys, girls, men, and women. And that includes labor trafficking as well as sex trafficking. And I think it's very important that we all always be mindful of that. And it's something for me too, in the work that I do, that I always want to keep at the forefront. And so whether I'm participating or whether I'm taking a back seat and being an observer, listening to other speakers, it's something that I'm always aware of. And my flags are always going, and my antennas rather, to make sure that, we are including everyone here. So the other thing I want to just keep in mind too is the word trafficking. When we talk about trafficking, I don't ever assume that that's a word that we all understand. I know too, for just speaking for myself as a survivor, it's not a word that I understood or fully came to understand until late in life, because when you are being victimized, when I was being victimized, I wasn't aware that this was connected with trafficking. I believed everything that I was told, that it was my fault and I was worthless and this is what I had coming to me. And it didn't start with the trafficking either. It didn't start with the trafficking. And also, just as the trafficking doesn't define who I am today, since I have my professional skills, I have my personal life, and I have my lived experience. So it's important that when we look at survivors of labor and sex trafficking, that we're not looking at them as survivors, but there are so many more layers to us than just what happened to us, because in life, so many people are surviving something, regardless of what that may look like. However, I did want to touch on that. I think it's very important that it comes down to vulnerabilities. So when we talk about displacements, which unfortunately, this is a global issue, this is an epidemic, this is happening all over the world. Yes, in some places more than others. We also need to be mindful that traffickers use technology, they use social media, they are masterminded. These women and men, they do their homework. They know where the disasters are. They know where the crises are. They know where the wars are breaking out. I mean, all you need to do is read the paper, turn on the TV, whatever that might look like through social media or technology, that's all you need to do. And there they have. We're feeding them all the information they need. They're already out there before things are set in place with what the emergency needs are for these individuals that are going through the crises that they need. These criminals are already at work. So how do we get an edge on it? We can get an edge on it by also using technology and social media as needed. So for me, I mean, when I look at and I think of displacement, there's so many layers for that, and that can look different in the sense of it could be through crisis, it could be through a war, it could be through many forms where someone is displaced. And I'm only going to share for my personal experience what displacement looked like, because growing up, I mean, shame and what happens in your environment is something that's common, and maybe in more places and more countries than others, where you don't bring shame. You bring, if you can't bring honor to your family, you don't bring anything. It's not something you talk about. What happens here stays here or gets swept under the carpet. So for me, what happened to me growing up was all that I knew. It's something that was embedded in me. So to me, that was my normal, but it didn't mean it was normal. I mean, I didn't realize until I went through counseling and I went through my own journey that what happened to me, certain things, was not normal. But why was it normal at the time is because it's the only thing I knew. I thought this is how people lived, you know, with different forms of domestic violence and different forms of abuse, because that's what I knew. Did it feel good? Absolutely not. Did it look good? Absolutely not. I lived in, I mean, for me, I was like, excuse me, constantly felt I was being re-traumatized, although I didn't connect it with that word at the time. But I felt like I was always being re-traumatized in the sense of fear, just constantly being scared. So that environment was something that I spent a lot of time in the coat closet because that was my place of safety where I would run to just to hide. So when I got to a certain age in my life, I chose to leave. You know, I mustered up some courage and I chose to leave. But what's important to know is that when I chose to leave, I wasn't afraid. I thought that my move was going to give me a better environment. I just wanted to be safe, okay? I was just looking for safety. I was looking where I could feel that I could trust the environment that I was going to be going to. And although I thought I had everything down pat, my I's dotted and my T's crossed, I didn't, because there were people that saw me and recognized my vulnerabilities that I didn't recognize within myself. And in addition, I also struggle with learning disabilities. So that compounded the issue. And it could look different for other people with what other layers they're walking into with their vulnerabilities. But one thing, there was one area that wasn't unknown, and that was to the criminals. They already spotted me. How they spotted me, where they pretended to be my friends, and they turned out that they weren't my friends at all. I also want to bring up something else. I talk about it a little bit more now because I think it's so important that my traffickers, I had more than one, and they were not all men. I had women traffickers too. And I think that's very important to take note with, because there are women traffickers all over the world. And there's this stigma that it's only men that are abusers. It's only men that are traffickers, and they victimize men and women into labor and sex trafficking. And that is so far from the truth. In fact, the statistics that you hear, just imagine these statistics being so much bigger, so much wider, because think of the people that don't report it. They don't report it because they're convinced and they believe it's their fault. They believe nobody's going to believe them. And they also, there's also the shame and fear, because the threats that you've heard my fellow panelists shared today about the threats, they are real. And you don't want to report what happened because you are afraid that you're going to get hurt. You are afraid that your loved ones are going to get hurt. So in some way you are protecting those too, but you are living with the shame and the fear. So there's many forms of displacement. Another thing I want to share, and this just happened a couple years ago, that it just shattered me at the time to witness. But there was a couple of survivors who were with their traffickers, and they wanted to get out. And fortunately, they found the resources to get out. And they found an organization that was a safe house. And it turned out that this particular organization was exploiting them and began abusing them. And so what did they end up doing? And it got so bad that they were afraid to report it, because there was some legal issues where part of who was part of this safe house running it was in law enforcement. So what did they end up doing? They went back to their traffickers. So, you know, when we talk about different forms of displacement, there's definitely a lot of different forms. And I think it's just so important that we have to look at the entire picture, because this is something that we need to address. And I think how I believe we can address this is by counteracting with technology, with social media, to connect and educate about labor and sex trafficking. Because the more we simplify the language too, when I talk about sex trafficking, labor trafficking, that word trafficking, it's so important that when we're educating, that we simplify this language, and it's very important we break it down, because if there's a victim, where most likely there is, someone is listening, in order for them to process and comprehend, oh my gosh, this is happening to me, or oh my gosh, this happened to me. We need to make it in terms that a child will understand, because we have this mentality that word trafficking can be very tricky. So I think we need to go back to the basics and really present it in a way that's simplified. The other thing, my apologies, I don't remember which panelists had mentioned it, but you all had mentioned such important things. But one of the things was about after the life. There's no such thing as after the life, because after the life, like I said, that's not incorporated with our statistics, is the people that don't report it. And they don't report it for good cause. They don't report it for shame, for fear, for retaliation. And those were my best companions. You know, I lived with shame. I lived with fear. I was so consumed with making sure no one was going to find out, because the two people I shared this with, and this really broke my heart in 1,000 pieces. But I remember when I met this guy after about a year after the life, and we fell in love. And long story short, he wanted to get married. And I thought that it was just so important that I share with him about my past, about what happened, because it just didn't feel right. And it was significant, you know. And so he still wanted to get married. So long story short, I recall our first argument, and it was around Thanksgiving time. And we had a very bad argument. It didn't mean we were getting divorced. It was just a bad argument. And long story short, it turned out that he said to me, okay, get ready. We're going to my parents for Thanksgiving dinner. And I just couldn't celebrate over turkey dinner and make believe everything was okay after this big, massive argument we had. So long story short, he came home that evening and he said to me, I'm so sorry. I says, well, I'm sorry too, for my part. He says, no, I'm not talking about our argument. He says, I was so angry with you for not going to my parents' house with me for Thanksgiving dinner that I told them all about your past. And they told me that if I didn't divorce you, that they would disown me. And so in 3 weeks, I received divorce papers. The reason I share that with you is because this is not for me to share other of my brothers and sisters' stories, but this is my story. But the only thing I will share with you is that this is not uncommon. And so we are very careful who we share with, what we share with. It's our protection. I will tell you, it's affected me with my education. It's affected many different areas of my life, my family. And it affects many people even in worse ways. But so it's a life sentence. And many times the criminals, they are let off the hook. And a lot of times they're let off the hook because we're not pursuing to press charges. And another reason is because they are not who they say they are. So I believe that moving forward, when it comes to this displacement and for these boys, girls, men, and women who are being victimized every day all over the world. I think we need to have that edge of continuing to educate and using social media and technology. Like when you put on the news and you hear all these things, I think we need to start putting on the news and hearing more education, more documentaries, more of what we're doing today to shout out and bring such awareness that everybody will know, children will know, the teens will know, men and women will know, so they could be aware of what the red flags are, what this looks like when being victimized and being sucked into the life of labor and sex trafficking. So thank you.
Gina, I always find it challenging to speak after you've spoken because you're such a moving and compelling speaker. Thank you. Thank you for everything you shared. So I'm not going to ask any questions, but I'm just going to emphasize a couple of points in what you said and just kind of take it to a visual in the sense that, displacement and what does this mean and who is being displaced in what situation. So, when you have situations going on in the home, and it doesn't happen obviously in every situation for every person who's experienced trafficking, but it's not uncommon to have, abuse or neglect within the home, in a way that's like a war. It's not external, but it's internal within the house, in the very place that you're supposed to feel safe. So, and then if that leads to a situation where there's a runaway or somebody chooses to leave to become more safe, they are physically displaced from their home, much as people that experience wartime displacement. So it's to me, it's very parallel. It's very similar. So just making
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it could be a house fire, it could be, guardians or parents that are on drugs, and the child or the kids end up in foster care. And I'm not one to say that foster care is all bad. However, I believe that there are definitely problems and issues that foster care, but, for me, it doesn't matter. I also want to throw out one more thing here is that whether it be foster care, whether it be organizations, law enforcement, whatever that may look like, I think there needs to be a stronger accountability. Just because someone says, well, I'm law enforcement, I'm social services, I'm foster care, that doesn't necessarily mean safe. I could do a whole presentation just on what safe means, and safe can maybe look there are many of these entities that I was violated by. However, it doesn't mean all entities are like that. I believe there's good and bad in everyone, but I believe that we need to have more accountability for people that do wrong. I believe that instead of naming and shaming victims, survivors, I believe we need to name and shame the sellers and the buyers. You start naming and shaming the sellers and the buyers, that's definitely going to be a way of accountability,
Absolutely.
So.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I can see that the Q&A looks clear at the moment. Unless there are any last minute questions that are going to come in, I wanted to take a moment to thank each and every one of our panelists today. Fantastic program. I appreciate all the work that went into putting it together, and all of the wise and really fascinating discussion that went on today. I want to thank all of our attendees for coming. Thank you for joining us, and look us up on the web, New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking, and get involved. Anonymous attendee. Okay. I will read this. I just wanted to thank Gina for sharing her story to help others. I unfortunately missed the beginning of the session and was interested in earlier speakers. Will a recording be sent or a link to somewhere online it will be uploaded to? Kate, can you address that?
Yes, we have been recording the session, and everybody who registered to attend will receive the link in 24 hours. We will then be putting it onto our YouTube channel so that this information can be spread, because this is our way of using technology to help share this information, try to take a bite out of the bad and try to input some good information to try to address this.
Thank you so much. And with that, we are concluded. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.